We have some breaking news that we are very sorry to report, and that is that Dolly Parton has died. Country music has no bigger or more beloved star than Parton, of course. Her career has spanned decades. This is a social media video making the announcement.
Dolly Parton spent her final year making jokes about death while quietly dealing with health problems she admitted she had ignored. She kept working, kept smiling, and kept reassuring everyone that she was fine. Then, on August 25th, 2026, the news nobody expected came. Dolly was gone at 80.
And good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kira Phillips. We're interrupting your regular programming and coming on the air because legendary actress, singer, songwriter, and entrepreneur Dolly Parton has passed away at the age of 80.
So what was really happening during those final months? Why did Dolly keep pushing forward despite her health struggles? And how did the people closest to her react when the end finally came? Join us as we uncover the final chapter of Dolly Parton's extraordinary life. Nobody knew how sick she was. Dolly died on Tuesday, August 25th, 2026, at Vanderbilt Ingram Cancer Center in Nashville, and her family confirmed the cause a few hours later as a brief battle with cancer, one she had never spoken about publicly before her death. That's pretty remarkable when you think about it. Dolly Parton had spent decades as one of the most famous and talked about women in entertainment, with almost every part of her life playing out in public. Yet she somehow kept her cancer diagnosis private until her representatives announced her death. In their statement, they remembered her as someone who spent her life bringing joy, laughter, hope, and integrity to everything she did. This is what genuinely gets everyone, though. People close to her knew she'd been sick for a while. They knew she'd been in and out of hospitals. They knew this past year had been rough on her. But according to what TMZ was told by sources familiar with the situation, when loved ones learned she'd been admitted to the hospital the week before she died, they rushed to Nashville expecting the same outcome as every other health scare she'd had that year, which was that she'd bounce back, get released, and post a video telling everybody to stop worrying. Everyone expected Dolly to come home again because that was what she had done after every other health scare. But had losing Carl taken more out of her than anyone around her truly realized? The grief she buried. Things really started to change for Dolly after March 3rd, 2025, when Carl Dean, her husband of nearly 60 years, died at 82. She didn't make a huge public event out of her grief. Instead, just days later, she released If You Hadn't Been There, a deeply personal song about the man she had spent most of her life with. She described Carl as the star of her life story, and coming from someone who had spent decades smiling, joking, and bringing joy to everyone else, that said a lot about just how much she had lost. After almost 60 years together, sometimes a song says what 100 interviews never could. What she admitted later, though, is the part that turns this from a sad story into a genuinely tragic one. Dolly told fans directly that she let her own health slide while she was caring for Carl during his illness, and then kept letting it slide after he was gone, because she simply didn't have it in her to look after herself on top of everything else. She said it plainly in an interview just days before her own death, telling people she'd been dealing with hard times with her health that she hadn't been able to address before Carl passed, because back then, all of her attention had gone to watching over him. Dolly had spent decades juggling a huge career, Dollywood, charity work, and countless other responsibilities. But while Carl was sick, taking care of herself seemed to fall further and further down the list. And after losing the person she had shared almost 60 years of her life with, getting back into a normal routine apparently wasn't easy. Sometimes, The person who spends years taking care of everyone else can be the one who forgets to take care of themselves. How did one of the most famous women in the world manage to keep the most important relationship in her life almost completely out of sight for nearly 60 years? A 60-year marriage. This is where the backstory actually matters, because Carl Dean wasn't a celebrity husband in any conventional sense. He ran an asphalt paving business in Nashville and, by most accounts, avoided the spotlight so completely that plenty of casual fans assumed for years that he didn't really exist, or that Dolly had made him up as some kind of publicity story. He wasn't at award shows either, and he wasn't in photos with her at premieres. He liked staying home, and Dolly let him have that, which, if people think about it, is a pretty remarkable thing for two people to agree on for nearly 6 decades, while one of them becomes one of the most famous women alive. That privacy is exactly why his death hit as hard as it did once people actually understood what their relationship looked like behind the curtain. Dolly wasn't performing grief the way celebrities sometimes do. She wrote him a song, thanked him publicly for 60 years of being her foundation, and then, by her own later admission, fell apart in a way that showed up in her body rather than in headlines. And honestly, that tracks with everything people know about her personality. Dolly Parton was not a woman who liked making her pain someone else's problem, so she absorbed it, kept working, kept smiling for cameras, and paid for it later. That habit of carrying everything herself didn't begin with fame, and it certainly didn't begin with Carl's illness. So where did Dolly get the drive to keep pushing through hardship while giving so much of herself to everyone else? The poverty she turned. Dolly's work ethic makes a lot more sense when people look at where she came from. She was the 4th of 12 children, growing up in a tiny one-room cabin in the Smoky Mountains with a family that had very little money. They were so poor that Dolly later said her father paid the doctor who delivered her with a sack of cornmeal because cash simply wasn't available. A sack of cornmeal for delivering a future superstar. Safe to say that doctor had absolutely no idea what had just arrived. She taught herself to play a homemade guitar by the time she was 7, got a real one from her uncle a year later, and was singing on local radio before most kids her age had finished elementary school. By 13, she was performing at the Grand Ole Opry, and not long after that, she was writing songs like Coat of Many Colors, which took the specific humiliation of wearing a coat made from scraps sewn together by her mother, and turned it into one of the most beloved story songs in American music. That childhood is also where the imagination library actually comes from. And it's a detail worth sitting with because it connects directly back to how she died. Dolly started the program in 1995, giving away free books to children in her home county, specifically in honor of her father, who never learned to read or write in his life. It grew from a small local effort into a global operation that has handed out well over 200 million books. And Dolly talked about it constantly as the achievement she was proudest of. Prouder than the Grammys and prouder than the records because it was personal. She spent her whole life trying to make sure other people didn't carry the same gap her father carried. It's hard not to notice the pattern. Her instinct, over and over, in her charity and in her marriage, and apparently in her final year, was always to fix somebody else's hardship before she ever got around to her own. By the time she died, Dolly had written more than 3,000 songs, sold well over 100 million records worldwide, and racked up 11 Grammy Awards, 3 Emmys, a Tony nomination, 2 Oscar nominations, and, just last year, the Jean Hersholt Humanitarian Award from the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. She crossed into Hollywood in 1980 with 9 to 5, playing opposite Jane Fonda and Lily Tomlin in a workplace comedy that still gets quoted today. And she wrote the title song for it in a single afternoon using her acrylic nails as a drum beat, which is such a specific Dolly way to write a #1 hit that it almost sounds made up. She was also, underneath the wigs and the rhinestones and the self-deprecating jokes about her own look, an extremely sharp businesswoman who fought to keep ownership of her music at a time when very few artists, let alone women in country music, managed to hold on to their own publishing rights. That business instinct is part of why she was still working on a Broadway musical and a hotel and a museum well into her 80s, because slowing down was never really part of the plan. Retirement wasn't a word that seemed to apply to her, and it's genuinely hard to separate how much of that late career output was ambition and how much of it was her trying to outrun what her body was telling her. Even as her body was clearly asking her to slow down, Dolly kept working and joking her way through every health scare. So how did a year filled with warning signs become a year spent convincing everyone that she was still perfectly fine? The year of I Ain't Dead Yet. What makes the last 12 months so hard to look back on now is how much of it Dolly spent reassuring everybody else instead of dealing with what was actually happening to her. In September 2025, she postponed her Las Vegas residency, citing health challenges and telling fans her doctors said she needed a few procedures, and even then she made it a joke, saying it must be time for her 100,000-mile checkup. That's peak Dolly, turning a genuinely worrying medical update into a punchline so nobody would panic. It didn't stop the panic for long, though. In October, her sister Frida posted something on Facebook asking people to pray for Dolly, which is about as alarming as a family's social media post can get, without actually saying anything, and it sent fans into a spiral. Dolly responded herself days later, point-blank asking her audience, "Do I look sick to you?" and insisting she wasn't dying, just dealing with a lot of rumors flying around. She came back to Dollywood in March 2026 for the park's opening day, sequined and smiling, telling the crowd she'd been worn down and worn out from grief and needed to rebuild herself spiritually, emotionally, and physically. She also talked about kidney stones. She talked about her immune system being out of whack. She never once, in any of these updates, mentioned cancer, and people now know that's because she didn't yet know or wasn't ready to say it publicly if she did. By May, she was still framing things optimistically, telling fans on Instagram that she was responding well to treatment and just needed more time before she was back to stage level, all while working on a Broadway musical and a new hotel and museum in Nashville. Because apparently even a body running on fumes couldn't talk Dolly Parton into actually resting. But by August, the gap between Dolly's hopeful updates and what was actually happening with her health was becoming impossible to ignore. So what happened in those final days that turned another difficult health scare into the goodbye nobody was prepared for? The final days. On August 14th, she was unable to attend the opening of a new ride at Dollywood and appeared by video instead, which in hindsight reads very differently than it did at the time. Then on August 21st, just 4 days before she died, she gave what turned out to be one of her last interviews, telling people she was going through hard times with her health, still framing it as something she was managing rather than something urgent. She was admitted to Vanderbilt University Medical Center that same week with kidney and autoimmune complications, and according to what TMZ reported, she died there on the morning of Tuesday, August 25th. Her nephew Brian Seaver was the one who announced her death in a video posted to her own Instagram account, which feels like exactly the kind of detail Dolly would have wanted, something personal and family-run, rather than a press release from a publicist nobody's ever heard of. Her official cause of death, cancer, wasn't revealed until later that day, meaning for a chunk of time, the entire world knew she was gone before anyone actually understood why. Once the news broke, it genuinely felt like the entire entertainment industry stopped what it was doing. Beyoncé posted a tribute calling Dolly the North Star and thanking her for a lifetime of art, generosity, and humor, which is a pretty striking thing to receive from someone who rarely comments publicly on other artists' deaths. Sabrina Carpenter, who'd recorded a version of Please, Please, Please with Dolly for her short and sweet deluxe album, wrote that meeting Dolly for the first time felt like meeting an angel walking the earth, and that she'd carry Dolly's humor and wisdom with her on the harder days ahead. Kelly Clarkson said Dolly had a way of making everyone around her feel special and seen. Pedro Pascal called her one of one. Kiki Palmer simply wrote that she was devastated. Carol Burnett, who worked with Dolly decades ago, remembered her personally cooking individual Thanksgiving dinners for an entire film crew, saying they were a family. That's who Dolly was. Jane Fonda and Lily Tomlin, her co-stars from 9 to 5, released a joint statement calling her a loyal friend and saying they never knew anyone like her, which lands a little differently when you remember that movie is now 45 years old, and those three women stayed close the entire time in between. Even political figures weighed in, praising her literacy work through the Imagination Library, the charity she built specifically to get free books into the hands of kids who might not otherwise have them. When you see that range of people, from pop stars a third her age to comedy legends who worked with her 50 years ago, all saying essentially the same thing about who she was as a person, it starts to explain why this particular death has hit so differently than a lot of celebrity deaths tend to. What really stands out about these tributes is how personal they were. People weren't just saying Dolly was talented or that she would be missed. They were remembering little moments that clearly stayed with them, like a Thanksgiving dinner she cooked, a truck ride, or a private conversation years ago. It says a lot about the kind of person she was. Dolly wasn't just someone people admired from a distance. The people who actually spent time with her seemed to remember exactly how she made them feel. And maybe that's why her death feels so personal to people who never actually knew her. How does someone who spent a lifetime making everyone else feel seen manage to hide so much of what she was going through herself? Why this feels different? The real tragedy here is that there wasn't one huge dramatic moment that changed everything. Dolly had spent months putting her own needs aside while caring for Carl. And after losing him, she still seemed more focused on reassuring everyone else than admitting just how difficult things had become for her. Even when her own health started getting worse, she kept smiling, making jokes, working, and telling fans not to worry. In a way, that was Dolly right until the end. She spent so much of her life trying to make other people feel better that she didn't always seem to leave enough room to take care of herself. She was still working on a Broadway musical. She was still opening a hotel. She was still doing interviews 4 days before she died, calmly discussing her health like it was one more item on a very long to-do list. There's also something almost unbearably fitting about the fact that even in her last public comments, she was still cracking jokes and still deflecting concern away from herself and toward whoever she was talking to. That instinct to make sure everybody else felt okay before she let herself be the priority is the same instinct that likely kept her from slowing down after Carl died, and it's the same instinct that probably kept her pushing through appearances and projects long after her body was telling her to stop. It's worth saying plainly that none of this is really unusual, even if it's unusually well documented in Dolly's case. A lot of people who lose a spouse after decades together go through exactly this. They put their own health on hold while caregiving, and then they keep putting it on hold afterward because grief doesn't leave much room for anything else, including doctor's appointments. What made Dolly's version of that pattern so visible is that she was famous enough for every stage of it to be tracked in real time, from the residency postponement to the sister's prayer request, to the sequined return at Dollywood, to the final interview 4 days before she died. Most people get to go through that privately. Dolly's version played out in front of an audience of millions, and she still managed to make most of it sound like good news. What's the Dolly Parton song or moment that means the most to you? And do you think the public ever really understood how much she was carrying in that last year? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.